Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I recently have done a bunch of videos talking about how I love to fish topwater baits and what some of the best topwater baits are for specific times of the year as well as seasons. And with respect to most of those videos, I've gotten questions from viewers wanting me to talk about what the best follow-up bait to a missed topwater strike is. And I thought that would be a good video, but I'm actually going to change it up a little bit and not just talk about topwaters. I want to give you my favorite follow-up bait to miss strikes for a bunch of different baits, because I think oftentimes what we hear or watch on YouTube is people talking about what's the best follow-up bait for a topwater blowup. But we don't really ever hear it for, hey, what about a crankbait or a spinner bait and all these different techniques. So I've got here a bunch of my favorite follow-up baits for each specific technique. I'll walk you through why I like to use them and why I feel like I have the best success on them. And ultimately, the key to being productive on the water is to recognize what your best follow-up bait is for what your primary techniques are, so that you can have rods rigged with these other baits to make a quick cast back into a spot where you may have had a bite. So we're going to talk about those today. Before I do get into that, though, I want to remind you guys that I do have a members only channel. So if that's something you would like to join for extra content from me, whether that's a monthly live stream or additional monthly videos, please check that out. Also, if you want to support the channel and you're looking to purchase some tackle, please use my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link. I'll put links to these baits that I'm talking about in the video description for you, in case that's something that interests you. The little bit of money I make from that goes right back into supporting the channel. So I appreciate it if you are using the link. If you're not using the link, it would be awesome if you started doing that. All right, so let's talk about missed strikes. So one of the biggest and most important reasons why this is important is because if you recognize that A, you had a bite, and B, you know what the good follow-up bait is, you could generate substantially more bites throughout the day. What I mean by that is, if you know how to trigger those fish to strike a secondary bait, you're probably going to increase your chances. Now, oftentimes what we hear people talking about with respect to this topic is the follow-up bait to a topwater bait. Well, that's all great and dandy, and one of the reasons why we hear people talking about this is because this is the easiest type of bait to recognize that you had a missed strike. Meaning, if I'm working this vixen across the surface and a fish blows up on it, I either hook them or I don't hook them. If I don't hook them, I know I had a missed strike. So oftentimes I think we just hear people talking about best follow-up baits for topwaters because you obviously know that you had a strike. The important thing to take away from this video, though, is you can very much follow up your topwater baits, but you can also follow up any of your other baits, whether it's a vibrating jig, a spinner bait, whatever moving bait you can think of, whatever type of flipping bait you can think of. Generally speaking, you can follow up with a secondary bait that will increase the odds of additional strike. Now, in terms of this video, I'm going to talk about more moving baits because that's where a lot of this comes into play. Meaning, if I miss a fish on a Texas rig or say on a wacky rig or on a jig, I'm probably just as good pitching back with the same bait as I would if I chose a different slow moving bait. Because one of the takeaways here is that generally you increase your odds, in my opinion, of getting that fish to bite a second time with a slower moving bait that stays within the strike zone. So if you're working a topwater bait, to me, one of the absolute best topwater bait follow-up baits that you can throw is just a fluke style bait, your soft jerk baits. A soft jerk bait is such a good bait because it does a good job at mimicking a dying bait fish. So if a fish strikes your vixen, knocks it 3 feet into the air, and you follow it up with a bait that's just gliding through the water column in the same area where this got knocked, it does a really good job of indicating to that bass head that, hey, they may have injured that fish that was on the top, And here it is now slowly floating by them. So generally speaking, one of the best baits that you can throw for any topwater blow up. So your buzz bait, your walking baits, your poppers, your choppos, whatever it is, you might want to think about having a soft jerk bait like a fluke tied up to throw right back into where that fish struck the topwater bait to start. Now that's kind of a basic, easy scenario. Now, if we're going to move down the line talking about some other moving baits, one of the ones that I think a lot of us have action on are swim baits. Now, swim baits can be fished throughout the water column, but generally speaking, they're doing a really good job at drawing fish up and feeding in that suspended part of the water column. Doesn't necessarily mean the bass were suspended with the bait, but the bass are feeding up. So if you're fishing a swim bait and you're bringing it through the water column, say 5 feet under the water, over 10 feet of water, generally that fish probably did come up from the bottom. And if you missed them on a swim bait, part of the problem is you either jerked, set the hook, and you pulled the bait out of there, or you kept reeling it and your bait was out of the strike zone. That's one of the reasons why we're talking about your moving baits in this video. Well, when that happens, one of my favorite follow-ups is going to be a hover rig. So you rig a soft jerkbait style bait. This is a Jackal Rhythm Wag on a hover rig, and you throw it back to roughly where you think you got bit on the swim bait. Now the reason I would rather throw a hover rig over, say, a weightless soft jerkbait is because a lot of times that fish did come up off the bottom. So when they come up, hit your swim bait, what do after they bite it? They go right back down to the bottom. If I throw a soft jerkbait that's weightless in there, that fish has to come back from the bottom. Not going to happen nearly as well as if you got a bait that's got a little bit of weight and it's gliding back down into the strike zone of that fish. So if you can get this back down to where the fish are in a faster manner, you're probably going to generate more strikes. Now, I don't want to throw a heavy bait in there that's going to go sit on the bottom, because generally speaking, I don't want a bait to be on the bottom. That fish was feeding up. What I want is a bait to get into their strike zone faster than a weightless bait. And a hover rig will do a great job acting like a dying bait fish, gliding and spiraling all over the place. And it's kind of the same scenario. That fish thinks that they injured the swim bait, and here it is falling into their wheelhouse. So I like to throw a hover rig for baits that are more in that suspended water column. Now, maybe I'm fishing a little bit shallower and I'm fishing around some cover, say with a spinner bait, or maybe it's a vibrating jig, something along the lines of this, where I'm fishing more of a specific strike zone. If I get knocked, I have a bait, a bass come and knock slack into the spinner bait, what I'm going to follow it up with is probably a weightless wacky rig. Now, the reason for that is I generally know roughly where that bite came from. So if I'm bringing this past the laydown tree, fish comes and hits it, I know I can throw a weightless wacky rig right back to that tree. And again, in this case, I'm probably fishing shallower, 5-6 foot of water or less. A weightless wacky rig does a great job of just falling down into that strike zone, does a really good job at generating strikes. But I really like the fact that I'm probably fishing isolated cover or very specific spots, so I know roughly where I got that bite, and therefore I can throw this right back in there. Great way at generating that strike. Another one, this is kind of along the same lines of topwater, but it's a little bit different. If you get bit on a frog, generally speaking, the best follow-up bait is going to be a Texas rigged punch bait of some form, whether it's a small little pit boss or whatever other creature style bait that you like to throw. The key is you're probably going to have it rigged on heavier weights, maybe a 3/4 ounce, ounce and a half, depending on how thick that cover is that you were fishing the frog. The frog allows you to identify where that fish is, but generally speaking, if they don't come back and hit this, if you can punch through that mat with a heavier weighted Texas rig, you're probably going to increase the odds of getting that fish to bite if they won't come back and hit the frog again. The last one here I'm going to talk about is a crankbait. So in this case, this is a deep diving crankbait. This is the Dredger 25.5, gets down there deep. I'm usually trying to get this to bang off the bottom, whether it's to come off the lip of a ledge, maybe deflect off a stump, cross a shell bar. Along those lines, generally speaking, though, I'm getting fish to commit to this is down on the bottom. Now, one of the issues with a crankbait, though, in my opinion, is a lot of times you don't get them to come back, and it has to do similar with that swim bait. This bait is down and out of the strike zone real fast. So they may have swung at it, they may have hit it once, but by the time they come back around, it's out of their wheelhouse, it's out of that strike zone. They're not nearly as interested. Plus, generally speaking, a lot of your bites on crankbaits are reactionary strikes. So maybe your crankbait deflected off of something and it created that reaction strike. Because of that, I generally don't like to throw the crankbait back for more than 1 or 2 casts. What I really have had a lot of success with the last couple of years is to pick up a casting jig or a football head jig, a heavier one, get it right back down to where I think that fish was in the strike zone. If I know there's a specific target there, a brush pile, a stump, a contour line break, something along those lines, I can throw this right back down there and work it really slow to generate strikes. One key with this is if they do not bite it on the, as you're dragging it along the bottom or right around that object, I like to actually give it a quick pop and get it to come up off the bottom. A lot of times those fish, what I found is they didn't bite the crankbait because they wanted it. They bit it out of that reactionary impulse. Well, if I can put a jig down there, a lot of times they'll come and investigate it without biting it. But if you go to stroke it and get it to come up high off the bottom, you create that reactionary strike again from that same fish that reacted to the crankbait. They'll do it to your casting jig or to your football jig. But I really like to switch it up with a bottom bait when I'm fishing it on, when I'm trying to follow up a crankbait miss, because those fish are generally still tied to the bottom. It's not like they're necessarily feeding up like they would with a swim bait. But it is very important to recognize what your best follow-up baits are for the certain technique that you were fishing that generated that initial strike. If you can identify which baits to use as a follow-up, you'll probably increase the number of bites. It really does make a difference for me. And I'm always aware of the baits that I'm throwing, what I think are my best follow-ups. Now, in most of these instances, sure, you could probably throw one of these baits and have the same look as some of the other follow-up baits, but it does seem like you have very specific ones based on where you think the fish are holding in the water column, what the forage is that they're eating at that time, and then just generally speaking, where that strike occurred. But if you can recognize all that, get a follow-up bait in there quickly, you probably can get that fish to bite again. So hopefully you found this helpful. Maybe you guys have a good bait that's a good follow-up as well. Put that in the comment section so the rest of us can learn from you. Stay tuned. New video coming tomorrow.